Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. My name is Andrea Allen, and I'm currently the president of the Alumni Association. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our first event of this year. The Alumni Association tries to host approximately an event every month or every 6 weeks for the school year for alumni to keep us all connected and to keep us all informed in regards to the same issues and topics that we studied at the Factor-Inwentash School. This evening, we're very, very pleased to have Anita Charleson-Touchie with us. And I'm going to start by sharing a land acknowledgement and just welcome everyone to the room. Okay. So we acknowledge that the city of Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We all have a responsibility to be active players in the decolonization of which we are currently enacting by learning, showing up, speaking up, and staying informed about the needs and desires of our Indigenous comrades. We recently joined with our Indigenous communities to urge our families, organizations that we work for, the municipal, provincial, and federal governments to remember the children who did not return and the survivors of residential school when we recently recognized the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. It is a public commemoration of the tragedy and painful history and ongoing impacts of residential school. We also came together through the long weekend that has passed for what some refer to as Thanksgiving. But it was a Thanksgiving Day that did not go so well for all of the participants in terms of creating peace between Indigenous and European settlers. My humble ask of you is to remember the true meaning of those recognized days and share that information with your family and your relations. I must also acknowledge the people like myself who were brought across the Atlantic without being given a choice, people who were brought on the transatlantic human trade ship. We must all recognize other nations. We must also recognize other nations who came to this land to colonize, and some who forgot that they were settlers. We give thanks to the Indigenous ancestors for their patience, but acknowledge that it has been exploited. Can we now take a few seconds and reflect on where we are individually situated and to whom the land belongs as we humbly proceed with our evening? We'll take a few seconds and reflect. Thank you. So this evening, our topic is Somatic Experiencing, which is copyrighted, in Indigenous Ways, Strengthening Trauma-Informed Care and Practice. And our presenter is Anita Charleson-Touchie. Anita's cultural name is Speaks with a Sea Serpent Tongue. I hope I don't make a mistake with this pronunciation, but she is a Nuu-chah-nulth, close, from the west coast of Vancouver Island, BC. Anita's husband is Tyson Touchie, and they have 6 children and 3 grandchildren. Anita holds a master's degree in counseling psychology from the University of Victoria, has trained with respected elders in methods of Indigenous healing, and has interned with Jane Middelton-Moz. Anita has been working in mental health, assisting individual families and communities for over 20 years. She's a cultural facilitator, a Somatic Experiencing Practitioner, and a Certified Canadian Counsellor. Anita values and utilizes a combination of clinical and cultural approaches in helping individual families and communities to heal from trauma. Anita is a sessional lecturer with the University of Toronto, Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work in the Indigenous Trauma Resiliency Program, and is a sole proprietor of Tyson Wellness in Nuu-chah-nulth. Taijmas means life and all that life has to offer. I'm very grateful to welcome Anita to join us this evening, and she will share with us her talk on somatic experiencing and Indigenous ways, strengthening trauma-informed care and practice. Hi, Anita.
Hello. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to see all of the beautiful faces, some familiar faces too. And I just want to take a moment to invite those of you who would like to write in the chat the land acknowledgement where you're situated at the moment. And while you're doing that, I want to just acknowledge where I am. I'm so grateful to be able to be connecting with you from my home community. It's a little village in Ucluelet, British Columbia. Our village name is Hitatsu, and that means safe harbor. And we are right in the harbor, and so I'm home in the traditional territory of Ucluelet First Nation. Let's see. Marianne's on Vancouver Island too. Hi. Toronto. Wow, it's great to see representation from so many different places. Thank you for taking time to do the land acknowledgement. And that, as you take time to acknowledge the land, I just want to invite you just to notice whatever it is that you notice. I know for me, when I take a moment to do the land acknowledgement, it reminds me not only of where I am, but the roots and the connectedness to the land. And for me, being in my home territory, my homeland, it means so much more, especially recently I lost, my dad passed away. And, a teaching that comes with that after our loved ones die, go home, we say, is that they're going back to the land, and that sacredness and connection to the land is really important to acknowledge. So thank you for taking time to acknowledge where you are. And I want to also start by saying that I am in my little home office, and you heard how many kids I have. I have 6 kids. 2 of them adults, 4 of them are home, ranging in age from 31 down to 5. So you might hear my younger ones, my more rambunctious ones, playing in the background, and that's okay. They know though when the door is closed that they have to give some space. So I just wanted to say that in case you hear them in the background. I always like to start connections, especially over Zoom and when we're together, with lighting of the candle. And this lighting of the candle is a way of strengthening connection to spirit. And in my Nuu-chah-nulth culture, we say connection to creator, connection to the ancestors. And through the pandemic, we had a strong teaching from my grandfather. You know, he said, we can't be together through this pandemic physically, but we can be together in spirit. And when he said that, you know, that reminded me of all of the lessons I've learned from elders over the years. And that is the strong connection that we have to spirit. And I'll be sharing some of those values and principles with you during our time together. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the candle. So can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the candle? Okay. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge Daniel, who has been great tech support for me. So he helped me prepare for this type of connection with you. So thank you, Daniel. So again, I'm going to start with lighting of the candle and saying a prayer. My elders always say start off in a good way. And for me, that means acknowledging connection to spirit, and also acknowledging that we can call on spirit to help us, to help guide us, to be with us, to help us tap into whatever teachings need to come through. And so with that, you know, that's the intention that I light the candle. And as I light the candle, I want to invite you just to notice, maybe get comfortable in your chair, feel your feet on the floor. I know that many of you probably have rare moments in your life where you actually have time to slow down and, you know, even participate in this type of online presentation. So just notice whatever it is that you're noticing within your body. Feel your feet on the floor. And as I light the candle, I want to invite you to notice the sounds as well. I will be using matches, so listen to the sound of the matches, look at the candlelight, and pay attention to your breath. Oftentimes when we're in the go, go, go mode, we tend to hold our breath. So just notice. And if you are holding your breath, just allow yourself to take a deep breath in and out. Creator ancestors, thank you for this day. Thank you for the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, the water that we drink. Thank you for the sunshine. Thank you for the ocean, rivers, lakes, mountains. Thank you for the animals. Thank you for all that life has to offer. And I ask that you wrap your loving, healing light around those who are struggling, those who might be struggling with addiction, those who might be feeling lost on the streets. Creator ancestors, I ask that you help by wrapping them in your loving, healing light. And I want to ask you to please wrap those who are grieving, send them some loving comfort. Creator ancestors, I thank you for this day. Ushakshi tle tsnas tlako tlako. So thank you for allowing me to take a moment to do that. And just know that the candle is lit. And if you have a candle nearby, then feel free to light your candle. That's one of the beautiful things about the elements of life. They offer a way of connection. And so we might not be together physically, but we can be together in spirit. And fire is one way that we can do that. So I've been invited to come and speak to you about somatic experiencing and Indigenous ways. And you know that this is an approach that I've learned over the years. I've learned from elders and mentors of how who I am as an Indigenous person and who I am as an Indigenous helper is close in line with what somatic experiencing has to offer. And I'll touch on that throughout the presentation. So we've done the land acknowledgements. So the picture that you see is actually where I live. So you get a little glimpse of that. The candle. So what I'm going to touch on is I'm going to touch on the natural laws in life. These are some teachings and principles that I've learned from elders along the way. I'm going to touch on trauma and the different types of trauma. I'm going to do an exercise that involves using the Bead Timeline. I'll touch on Indigenous worldview, values, and beliefs. And then when I start to talk about healing, I'll touch on Indigenous culture, the Polyvagal Theory, Somatic Experiencing, and embodiment. So I've learned that from a number of different elders. When I first started on as a helper on my journey, I was fortunate to be a part of the Kuasa counseling program. And that Kuasa counseling program was a partnership between Vancouver Island University and the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. And so this Kuasa counseling program offered Western ways of helping and healing and Nuu-chah-nulth ways of helping and healing. So a part of that program integrated language, Nuu-chah-nulth language, and elders' teachings and hands-on healing practice. So it was during this time that I started being introduced to these concepts. And I need to mention that, you know, I'm Nuu-chah-nulth, I'm Yu-shuth, but I wasn't raised up to know that. Both of my parents were forced to attend residential school, and same with my grandparents and my aunties and uncles, some of my cousins. And so, you know, that's why it was so significant for me to be a part of this Kuasa counseling program. And at the time, it wasn't the counseling that drew me to the program, it was the culture, because I wasn't raised up in my culture. I was connected to some of my culture, but there was a void and I was yearning for more. And so when I started learning from elders in this Kuasa counseling program, these were some of the concepts that they brought forward. You know, the infinity symbol that you see on the screen represents the teaching that no matter who you are or where you're from, there's positive and negative experiences in life. And that's a natural law in life. You know, we can't get around that. We can't live our life in nothing but positive. You know, that's like the Pollyanna view of the world, because it's not realistic. And it's really detrimental for us to live in all negative, you know, that vortex. So if you imagine in the center of the infinity symbol, a vortex that can pull you in. So we have to be able to live in balance, and that's accepting that there's positive and negative. No matter who we are or where we're from, there's no getting around that. It's the reality, a natural law in life. And the concentric circles that you see, there's self, family, community, nation, all of humanity. Culture's also in there. And that represents, in my culture, we say Hishukish Tsawak. And Hishukish Tsawak means everything is one and all is interconnected. And so what that means is that what happens in one part of this system has a ripple effect on all of the other parts, and that's positively or negatively. And so we have to keep that in mind in everything we do in life. The wave that you see has to do with, you know, when you live in balance, when you are going from positive to negative, you know, that reminds me of this Hoberman sphere. I like to use this. So if you imagine the positive and negative experiences in life, you know, things happen in life and that's positive, negative. What that looks like, what it starts to look like is that wave, the natural flow in life. And as I share more in the presentation, what we're going to find is that sometimes some things get too overwhelming. Sometimes some things get too overwhelming and cause us to look at everything and everyone outside of ourselves. We can't look in. Or things get so overwhelming that we shut down, we disconnect. So what we want to strive for is that natural rhythm in life. We want to keep maintaining that. And, you know, talking about trauma, these are some of the things that my elders have said about trauma. With trauma, there is a disconnection between the self and spirit. The spirit has left or has been jolted from the body. And, you know, this is tied to, in my culture, the belief is that spirit is in everything that we do. The belief is that there's a thin veil between our physical reality, so the physical world, and spirit. And so with that in mind, we always have to take time to acknowledge and connect to spirit. And, you know, this belief forms the basis of a lot of the cultural practices that come through. You know, even you see it in the lighting of the candle, saying the prayer. So there's also the teaching that there's an imbalance and a struggle with life energy. And again, you know, using the Hoberman sphere, you can see that if sometimes people struggle with life energy, if they're feeling stuck or shut down, or all over the place, where life is so busy. You know, if I'm going to focus on everything and everyone outside of myself, then that makes it's a way of disconnecting as well. So what is trauma? Trauma happens when the organism is strained beyond its adaptational capacity to regulate states of arousal. Trauma originates as a response in the nervous system and does not originate in an event. So trauma is in the nervous system, not in the event. And trauma is also subjective. And what that means is, you know, what is traumatic for me may not be so for you. So it depends on the individual and their capacities. So there's different types of trauma that have been defined. Sorry. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder or developmental trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, shock trauma, intergenerational trauma, collective trauma. And you know, I'm not going to go into detail about the definitions of these types of trauma. What I will say is developmental trauma has to do with events that are overwhelming as a child grows. Post-traumatic stress disorder is an individual experience of trauma, so it focuses on the individual. Intergenerational trauma is when trauma is experienced in one generation and goes unresolved or unhealed and gets passed on to the next. And collective trauma is when a mass group of people experience a similar event, like war or residential school, for example. And I also want to acknowledge, the historical and current waves of oppression that Indigenous people continue to face. So historical waves, some of them include disease and depopulation. So at the time of first contact, millions of Indigenous people died from disease, epidemics, and removal from the land and resources, laws and policies like the Indian Act, the Indian residential school system experience, Indian hospitals, the 60s scoop. So those are some of the historical waves, and there are more. These are some of the ones that have had major impacts on our families and communities. And some of the current waves include the child welfare system, the prison system, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and men, and mistreatment within the healthcare system. So I want to acknowledge that, because this is, some of the current experiences that are impacting the lives of Indigenous people today. And what's also important to know is that trauma disrupts. Trauma disrupts the natural order of relationships or connection, and can occur on all levels. So, it can occur on the individual level, family level, community level, cultural level, nation, and all of humanity. I have a Bead timeline here that I want to share, and I'm just going to stop my sharing of the screen so that you can see. So this is a bead timeline that was created by Suzanne Camp. Suzanne Camp is a teacher on Vancouver Island in the Courtenay School District. And she created this bead timeline to help teach students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, about how rooted Indigenous people are to the land. And so I've adapted this timeline. So I've added some other events that weren't on her list, but you can see on the slide, I've shared the link of, if you're interested in learning how to create your own, then you can follow the link. So you can see that on this timeline, there's beads, there's different colored beads. So each bead represents 20 years. So each color represents 100 years because there's 5 beads in every color. The length of this bead timeline is 15,000 years. So it's quite long. It's probably 8 feet long. The reason why this bead timeline is 15,000 years long is because actually at the time I made my bead timeline, it was 10,000 years long. And it was 10,000 years long because at the time, that was the oldest, the archaeological site in BC was 10,000 years old. That proves that the Indigenous people of the area had been there for that long. But since then, I think it was a few years back, they found an even older site in Healthsick territory, Bella. That's 15,000 years. And so, you know, when I talked earlier about the significance and sacredness of the land, how many generations, you know, when you look at 15,000 years, that's how many generations have been on the land. So the bead, this timeline, this bead on this timeline represents our calendar year, the time when we began using our current calendar system. So that's what this bead represents. We go further down. This bead represents the time that the pyramids were built. And this bead represents the work of Rayanne Eisler. Rayanne Eisler wrote she did research. Her and her family were Holocaust survivors. So from a very young age, she fled Europe with her family. They made their way to South America and eventually made their way to the United States. But one of the things that she said was that from a very young age, she always wondered, why are people violent? Why do people hurt one another? And so she dedicated her life to researching that. And what she discovered through her various disciplines of research was that she pinpointed a particular time in history. That's what this bead means. She pinpointed a particular time in history when societies began to shift from partnership societies to dominator societies. And so, you know, partnership societies reflect a society built around the circle structure. So unity, belonging, peace, femininity was valued. And then the dominator society reflects more of the pyramid structure, the hierarchy, the competition, selfism, division, the zero-sum model. So it's beyond the scope of our time and, you know, in this presentation to go into the details of her research. But the main thing that we need to be aware of is that we know that historically, like thousands of years ago, all of society was rooted in the partnership way of life. And essentially what shifted that is trauma. And so, you know, looking back on this bead timeline, you know, that's what gives me hope when I use this timeline, is that we know that a shift happened. And for Indigenous people, like if you look at the timeline here, this is when the shift happened in Europe. And then we go along the timeline, and this red flag on the timeline represents the age of Canada. And, you know, these other beads represent impacts like residential school, contact and colonization. And so, you know, one of the things that I hope that you can gather as the presentation continues is that Indigenous people, and, you know, I'm talking about Canada because that's where we are, and BC in particular, you know, with this timeline, are rooted deeply to the land. And with the rootedness, we carry values, beliefs, and principles that help us to maintain the partnership way of living. And I have hope because, you know, in comparison to the length of this bead, the red flag isn't so long ago, right? Those other beads, it's not that long ago. And so, yeah, I want to invite you to sit with that. And I'll continue with the presentation. And one of the things that I forgot to say off the bat was that we'll have questions at the end of the presentation, because what I find is that the time goes by so fast and there's a lot of information that I want to share. And I want to pass on as much as I can. So if you can hold your question and get back to me later. So Indigenous worldview, these are some of the things that resonate. And, you know, there's some that are shared and there's some similarities, there's some differences across Indigenous populations. And so again, you know, the thing that I want to share is that these are some things that I've learned from elders along the way in my life and my experience, and they might be similar or different. So I talked about the relationship to the land, you know, that again, this comes back to a teaching about when our loved ones die and pass on, they go home and become a part of the land. You know, and when you look at the timeline, the speed timeline, and remember and see how many generations are in the land. You know, there's a definite resonance with sacredness. Holism and interconnection. I talked about, in my language, we say hishukish zawak. So what happens to one part of the system will have a ripple effect on all the other parts. So that's hishukish zawak. There's also a principle called hishuk-nish zawak. And to me, it resonates even more and has more power. And it means I am one with everything. So not only is everything connected and everything one, but I am one with everything. And when I say I am one with everything, I connect with a deep sense of responsibility and accountability to make sure that, you know, I live my life in a good way. Again, balance. So that represents the positive and negative experiences in life. It also, to me, represents the natural law of give and take. You know, it's like that's something that occurs if I go out to gather cedar bark, if I want to make a cedar basket or a cedar headband. I don't just go out and take it. The natural law tells me that I have to give something to the cedar tree because that cedar tree is giving me something. So, you know, what I would offer is prayer. You know, one thing that has been adopted here is tobacco. You know, I might offer some tobacco. So that natural law of give and take, that's a part of balance too. Culture and ceremony, the importance of culture and ceremony in helping to heal. The photo that you see here is from a celebration of life. So it was my grandparents' wish to have a celebration of life for them while they were still living. And so I'm in there dancing with my sisters, cousins, nieces, daughters. So culture and ceremony are an important part of practicing and living those laws. Spirituality, I mentioned, the belief in the thin veil between our physical world and spiritual. And there's different elements that we use to connect with spirit. You know, this is our front yard, the ocean. And, you know, that's one of the forms of medicine that we use here. And we call it Nuu-chah-nulth, where we go into the water, the ocean, the river, the lake, to cleanse. So spirituality is an important part. And here's a quote that captures Nuu-chah-nulth worldview. A common belief is that we are all endowed with the gift of life from the Creator. We believe that the Creator lives on the hills and the land. Creator also lives on the waters, the rivers, lakes, and oceans. And Creator lives and moves under the seas and oceans, lives beyond the horizons and in the beyond, lives in the heavens above us all. These beliefs form the basis of our need to coexist with nature and all the creatures thereon. It is believed that even all the inanimate seen around us also are life, and that as human beings, we are to form balance with this life that lives around us in nature. And this was writings from Roy Hayupas, who was an elder from Ahousaht. So the dominator way of life has disrupted who we are. And, you know, as I say that, I reflect on the historical traumas. You know, in life, there are traumatic experiences, you know, that occur without being imposed by a dominator society. Most of the time in those circumstances, culture and ceremony offer a way to work through that trauma. So, you know, that I'm reflecting on that there's a difference, that yes, there are traumas that occur without being imposed by a dominator society. But, you know, in my experience, I'm a second generation residential school survivor. I didn't attend residential school, but my parents and grandparents did. And since then, you know, the trauma's been resonating and being passed down. So I was born into trauma. And that's what I'm reflecting on, that the dominator way of life has disrupted who we are as Indigenous people. And actually, you know, I was listening to Stephen Porges. He developed the Polyvagal Theory, and he actually says that all of humanity is experiencing trauma. You know, so it's we're all disrupted. Yeah. So all societies, you know, this is what gives me hope, is that all societies are rooted in the partnership way of life. So whether we realize it or not, somewhere in our lineage, there's a connection to the partnership way of life. So what we want to be able to do is rebuild and return to the circle. So, you know, there's different ways of doing that by focusing on the self, family, community, and culture. And in my training as a somatic experiencing practitioner, in my training, I've learned that, you know, the approach focuses on individuals and sometimes groups. And so what I've always done is ask myself, how does this fit for who I am as Nuu-chah-nulth? How does this fit for who I am as a Nuu-chah-nulth woman? And so, you know, that's what I want to share a bit more about. So the Polyvagal Theory is a theory that was developed by Stephen Porges. And one of the things that he talks about in the Polyvagal Theory is neuroception. And essentially what neuroception is the idea that we all have within us a transmitter in our brain that is constantly scanning the environment. You know, whether we know it or not, that part of our brain is always active, always scanning, looking around, watching for cues of safety or signs of danger. So the environment impacts our sense of feeling safe or activates our defensive survival response. And the Polyvagal Theory identifies states of engagement, so moments when we're connecting socially. It identifies states of mobilization, so there's an energy to move in response to danger, so a defensiveness by either fighting or fleeing. Or if you can't fight or flee, then you shift into a state of shutting down or collapsing. And that's when you can't escape. So you go into a freeze. So again, using this, you know, this is one thing that I love about somatic experiencing, is that it connects us as human beings in terms of an approach that fits. So we have moments of engagement, and what that would look like is being in that natural flow. Moments of fighting or fleeing, you can imagine, would be like more energy. And moments of collapse is, of course, shutting down. So depending on our physiological state, that will dictate what we do. So the Polyvagal Theory touches on social engagement, the fight-flight response, the freeze response. Defensive responses or survival responses occur when a traumatic event happens. Our bodies mobilize a huge amount of energy to fight or flee or protect ourselves or others. This is our sympathetic nervous system working for us, and many refer to it as the fight, flight, or protect response. So we get more energy into our system, and that's important to keep in mind, that it mobilizes energy. Then there's the freeze or hide response. So if we can't effectively fight or flee or protect, then we may go into freeze. We save our energy for later and may feel disconnected from what's happening. This is part of our parasympathetic nervous system. So when in the freeze response, we may have trouble responding to questions. We might be unable to act to protect ourselves or others and appear unconscious or dead. And this is a brilliant survival strategy, but we do not have a sense of safety and goodness in the world. So when we're in that state, our body continues to pump hormones. When we're in the fight and freeze state, for example, our body will pump adrenaline and cortisol to help us to fight or flee. And it's important to know that when we're in freeze, our body still pumps adrenaline and cortisol, even though we're in freeze. And this is where adverse childhood experiences comes in. And if you're familiar with the ACEs study, you know, that links adverse childhood experiences or trauma to chronic health conditions. So they found a connection with the higher number of adverse childhood experiences to the higher number of chronic health conditions. And, you know, when you have that understanding that the hormones continue to pump through your system when you're in fight, flee, or freeze, you know, then it makes sense, especially when you're constantly facing the different forms of traumatic experiences or oppression. So, safe and supported. Ideally, we want to find our way to safety and get support. This helps to bring us back to a state of regulation. It supports good rest and repair in our body. It allows us to feel safety and goodness in the world. It helps us feel safe enough to connect to ourselves, others, nature, or spirit. Safety and support in our environment increases the likelihood of moving out of the freeze response. So the more we feel safe, then the more our guard goes down. This allows access to the fight, flight, and protect energy and helps that energy move through our system. So when we're in a freeze response, so something happens in our life that's overwhelming, we might experience this, but go into freeze. And it's important to know that when you come out of freeze, then that energy is still there and has to be moved. So if we have support to move through this process, we will not experience trauma symptoms after these kind of life events. And that comes back to the subjectivity of trauma. So what's traumatic for you might not be for me, and vice versa. So this healthy resolution process may not happen all at once, and it may take weeks or months to resolve. We find our way back to an internal feeling of safety and goodness in the world. And we call that resourcing. So that infinity symbol, it's about coming out of the pain and moving to strengths and resources. If we can't get to safety and support, then we continue to bounce between the fight, flee, and protect states and the freeze states. Without safety and support, our nervous system cannot go through this resolution process and reset back to a sense of safety and goodness in the world. So we'll be stuck in that activated state. We can also disrupt the process if we stop the process from moving through. So our bodies are wise. And what I find is that our body has a natural way, a natural wisdom that comes out. So for example, you might have somebody that starts to cry, and that's okay. You know, we call that, it's called discharge, where that energy finds a way out of the body. Sometimes that could be shaking. It could be vocalisms. The main thing is that if we learn to shut down the tears, if we learn to be afraid of that shaking, then that stops the move through the trauma. And then that facilitates the stuckness of trauma. So what we want to do is help to move that energy. And here's a quote from one of my elders, late Ray Seacher. What you're saying is what my ancestors knew. You're only saying it in a different language. And I had the pleasure to sit with Ray in a somatic experiencing class in 2001, 2002. And that's when he said this. we were sitting in the Somatic Experiencing, and the instructor was passing on the teachings. And that has always stuck with me because it highlights that the wisdom, not only of our body, but for me, the wisdom of our Indigenous culture. So when I'm talking about healing, you know, healing starts with the self. So it's important to have an honest reflection of your own historical and intergenerational trauma. Do your healing work, and like, you know, our elder mentor Jane says, keep your basement clean. Because if you don't do your work, that's going to interfere and interrupt the connection and your ability to help others work through their trauma. For families, you know, when you heal yourself, you also heal your family. And it goes back to that ripple effect. And it's important to explore your family's values. You know, what is at the center of your family values? What's driving your family's behavior? So for families, that's really important to explore. At the community level, we want to look at trauma-informed education and trauma-informed practice. And we want to question the health and wellness of the systems. Culturally, we want to remain open to understanding Indigenous worldview, values, and beliefs. And, you know, if you're a settler, you know, then I want to encourage you to explore your roots. Look at your history and where you come from, because that's a part of your culture. And to explore bridging worldviews. You know, I mentioned that's been my approach since learning more about who I am. It's like anytime I learn something new, I ask, how does this fit for who I am as Nuu-chah-nulth? And how can I bring both, you know, like somatic experiencing and Indigenous ways together? And embrace and practice the values. And education and awareness about historical trauma is important. And here's a question that Jane really helped me understand, and the importance of exploring. Is it tradition or is it dysfunction? You know, one of the things that I've really realized along the way is that, you know, when trauma disrupts self, family, community, and nation, and we have generations experiencing pain and trauma, how has that impacted our culture? How has residential school and the brainwashing that occurred in the residential school system impacted the teachings that are being passed on culturally? So it's a really good question to ask. And I think about this quote by, I can't remember her first name, Matthew. But she said, you can't expect to walk through water without getting wet, you know? And many generations who went through residential school didn't have the safety or support to process their trauma. And yeah, anyway, I want to let you sit with that. Moving through, So what we want to do is pay attention to personal triggers or activations. Bring your awareness to the signs that signal you're behaving from the survival response. So the more you can notice and take inventory of what's happening inside of you, whether, you know, you're feeling tightness in your jaw or your shoulders are tight. For me, when I'm feeling tight in the jaw, that's a signal to me that I just, you know, I just hurried by some anger at some point in the day and didn't acknowledge it. So that's, for me, I know when I'm holding anger. Connect with someone that you trust. Create a safe place in your home and or office. Somewhere that is your safe haven that you can go to, because like we've learned, we're always scanning the environment. And so if we have a place of safety, cues that signal safety around us, that will help us come to a place of settled. Create a self-care or wellness plan. Practice self-regulation tools like a self-hug, tapping, meditation. Watch a comforting movie. Use your self-care plan, and I can't say them enough. Too many of us have our self-care plans but don't act on it. So practice extreme self-care. Create a routine and structure in your life to create a safe container. So routine and structure does that with daily goals, wellness plan. Limit the amount of stress taken in from media and social media. And Indigenous culture and ceremony is a practice of resourcing and regulation. So, you know, I've experienced the power of culture and ceremony and how it does help bring us back to that place of settledness and connection to the natural flow in life. So I want to finish with this embodiment exercise. So I want to invite you to stand up. If you can, take a moment, stand up. Place your feet shoulder width apart. Take a deep breath in. Hold it for a second and out. Continue to stand, and you're welcome to keep your eyes open or closed. Now I want to invite you to hold both of your hands up to signal a sense of gratitude to Creator and the ancestors. And raise your hands higher and connect with the sense of calm and regulation as you connect with their energy. Deep breath in. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita.
You're welcome.
My camera moved. Yes, so I really want to thank you. I wish to thank you so much for refreshing our memories, our awareness about how the body carries these experiences of disruption. And the concept of partnership has a historical legacy that we can all tap into.